Czechast, a podcast in English about Czech and Moravian society, history, culture and economy.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Czechast, the podcast where we explore all things Czech, history, culture and the people shaping them today. I'm Vít Pohanka and my guest today is Petr Kopecký, president of the University of Ostrava. A literary scholar and academic leader, he has devoted much of his research to environmental and ecological literary criticism, particularly in the context of American literature. In our conversation, we touch on three themes in particular. First, the fast-changing role of technology in teaching.
So a critical approach to AI is something that we are trying to cultivate. I mean, it will be here with us.
Whether we like it or not.
Whether we like it, exactly. So the first attempts in places like Italy and Australia, where at academia they discussed whether or not AI should be banned at universities. I mean, it's just impossible. You have to work with that. It's very challenging. That's a topic of lots of debates we have been having at this university, and I'm sure it's the same at other universities.
Petr Kopecký also serves as chair of the John Steinbeck Society, keeping alive the legacy of one of America's most influential writers. So, you will also learn how John Steinbeck was received and often misinterpreted in communist Czechoslovakia.
He was interpreted as a pro-communist writer. He was not definitely a pro-communist writer. So, in other words, he was misinterpreted. He was conveniently presented as somebody who was in line with the prevailing communist ideology.
And finally, Petr Kopecký explains what people still get wrong about Ostrava, Czechia's third largest city.
What also needs to change is the stereotypical image of Ostrava, the myth of Ostrava being really an ugly and dirty and polluted city.
Let me just add shortly that after our conversation, Petr Kopecký and I agreed that while the official Czech title is rector, which we used in this podcast, we'll use president of the university in the future, because it's a term that is clearer and more easily understood by listeners abroad. I'm Vít Pohanka, and thank you for tuning in.
Czechast, a podcast in English about all things Czech. Whether you're an English-speaking expat living in Czechia and Slovakia, or a descendant of the Czechs, Moravians and Slovaks who left for a better life in America, Australia, Britain or Canada so long ago that you don't speak the language of the old country, this podcast in English is for you.
My name is Petr Kopecký and I'm currently the rector of the University of Ostrava. Though I'm not a local, I was born and raised in the Beskedy Mountains in Rožnov pod Radoštěm. I've been working at this university for 27 years now. I was elected the rector of the university in 2023. And the reason I do what I do is that I see quality education as a key to lots of problems and challenges we are facing today.
As you mentioned, you grew up in the Beskedy Mountains. You were born actually in Valašské Meziříčí, but you grew up in Rožnov, right? What was it like when you were growing up there? And how, did you become interested in English and American culture?
Well, the 1990s were a period of extreme freedom. You could afford to do things that are unimaginable today, as people who lived through the 1990s well remember. I was a high school student in the early 1990s, and all the influences that all of a sudden were able to come to the Czech Republic, be it in literature or music, of course I was exposed to those. So I was a fan of punk rock music, Anglo-American punk rock music. I was a fan of Anglo-American literature, beat literature, romantic literature. And I realized back then, today I realize it to the full, that both the Anglophone music and literature were a very good gate to the very rich culture of the Anglophone countries, of the English-speaking countries.
Allow me just to mention that with me it was very similar. Actually, I started learning English because I loved Winnetou and the Karl May novels, which he wrote without ever being in the US. He actually went there later. But later on, of course, I listened to the Beatles and I listened to the music. I was interested, to know what they actually sing about. So that's the same thing, I suppose.
Exactly. Actually, I wrote one of my publications about 20 years ago about the perception of Karl May's books in Czechoslovakia about cowboys and Indians in the heart of Europe. So yeah, you're definitely right.
So why did you decide to study English here at Ostrava University? Why not Olomouc, or why not Brno, or some other places? Was it just because it was closer?
Well, I did submit more applications, to be honest with you, but you may well remember that it was extremely hard to get admitted to those English programs. It was very competitive and there was a lot of demand for that. So I believe that I applied for more universities, but I ended up here in Ostrava, and I've got no regrets because honestly speaking, at high school I was not a very diligent and enthusiastic student, but I became very enthusiastic and hardworking as a university student because my teachers here in Ostrava in the English department were really interested in what I had to say. They motivated me, they inspired me, they provoked my thoughts, and we had really open discussions. So we did not only learn things by heart. So that was still the prevalent mode of teaching back then, not only at universities but also high schools.
But you did your doctoral studies and you got your habilitation at the Palacký University in Olomouc, right? Was there a big difference between Ostrava and Olomouc? I don't mean this in any mean way against Ostrava or anything. I mean, was there a difference?
Not really. The difference was that Olomouc had a doctoral program, which we didn't have back then. We now have the doctoral program, and I was responsible for it until very recently. But I think that the English departments are comparable. The spirit of freedom was perhaps thriving more in Olomouc, and it was due to people like Josef Jarab, who was my tutor at the doctoral level, but he also helped me habilitate to get what we call docentura, so to become an associate professor. So for those of your listeners, Professor Jarab was the first freely elected president of a Czechoslovak university after the Velvet Revolution. He was elected in late 1989. So basically, when the Velvet Revolution was still underway, he then became an important politician, senator, and a hot candidate for presidency at one point in the past. But he's currently deceased. But at the same time, he was a very respected American literature expert, the first president of the European Association for American Studies. So he was a great tutor, but he was inspiring in other ways. He was a homo politicus, which I am to a certain extent too very much interested in things that are happening around me without looking at the word politics in a negative way, because politics is lots of things that surround us.
I can only confirm, having been a student of Josef Jarab in the late 1980s, when he was a kind of a guru for us, as you can imagine, because he was a professor of, at that time he was associate professor because he was no member of the party. Yep. And he was publishing his articles abroad. I mean, he was internationally known even then. Yep. So I think he was a great personality. So if we can just briefly stop there, how important do you think such personalities are, especially in the regions, in the provinces? And I don't mean this disrespectfully again, but I think for us, for my generation at least, Josef Jarab was the mover and shaker. He was a great inspiration. Do you think he still was even after the fall of communism? And how such personalities can function?
Actually, after he deceased, I wrote an obituary for Deník N, Josef Jarab's obituary, where I listed all his achievements, but I also concluded the text by saying that he was a great inspiration and he will remain one for many people like me, because I know other people who were greatly inspired by him, who were his students, PhD students, and now they are in local politics. deputies of mayors in a city like Ostrava. So we have a deputy mayor who was Jarab's tutor too. And so he's definitely important for regions. By the way, Josef Jarab was living in Ostrava for a long time, not in Lomos, and he was a great fan of Baník Ostrava, the local football club. But he, due to his direct experience with the United States of America, he knew what it felt like to live in a free society. And the word American for a long time, even in the 1990s, after the revolution, was very often seen as synonymous with with freedom and liberty. And he knew what it meant, and he was able to communicate that well, not only to his students, but also publicly, also as a politician. So with this direct experience with democracy and democratic values, he was able to build on those democratic values as the new universities were established after the long period of communism. And even today I see universities as strongholds and bastions where democratic values should be cultivated and even defended, and that becomes more and more topical in these turbulent times.
Back to you and your research. You kind of focus on American environmental literature, is that right?
That's right.
And a kind of ecological criticism, etc. Why? Let me ask you that like that.
Okay, long story short, in the 1990s, as I was a university student, as I told you, I lived in the Beskid Mountains, and that's when a project was introduced by the giant mining company OKD, whose headquarters was here in Ostrava, and that meant that a big coal mine, underground coal mine, was supposed to be opened in the Beskid Mountains, in the largest landscape protected area. And both local authorities but also NGOs were opposing that, and I put together a coalition of 11 NGOs that were opposing this project. So let's say as a student I was also a kind of environmentalist, and I was able to well connect especially American and British literature, where there is a very strong tradition of environmental thought and environmental philosophy with practical environmentalism. So that's the reason.
We live in the time of social networks, X, TikTok. Environmental literature doesn't seem to be kind of the first thing that students would concentrate on these days. Am I wrong with that? And if I'm not wrong, how can you make that attractive for young people today?
Well, there is not much data, so I would be only speculating if I were to respond directly to your question. But I think that there is growing interest, that's for sure, because I was perhaps the first eco-critic in the country, by which I mean I applied what's called environmental or ecological literary criticism, which is a very strong stream of literary criticism in the West, especially the United States, the UK, but also Germany. So there are hundreds, if not thousands, of eco-critics in the United States. But I was probably the first one in the Czech Republic about 22, 23 years ago, but I'm really glad I can say that this perspective on literature is becoming more and more prominent, and then there is a growing interest. Only a few days ago I received an invitation from students at Masaryk University to take part in a workshop on eco-criticism at Masaryk University. So that's great news. So the interest is definitely growing, and it's no wonder, because we are living at a time of environmental crisis or emergency, whatever you want to call it, and that's a concern that's very close to the youth, to young people, perhaps more than to the people that are my age or to the elderly. That's why we often talk about environmental anxiety, which is a real problem that psychologists deal with when it comes to the youth. And as for literature, why environmental literature? I think that we usually work with scientific and statistical data, but however shocking the data are, they do not really render the lived experience and reality. But I think that literature does have the potential to appeal to people's imagination and emotion, and to create new narratives and frames of vision that help us better understand what's going on the global scale.
I don't want to dwell on this subject too much, but let me just mention that one of my schoolmates from Olomouc, and I don't want to name any names, who happens to be teaching literature as well in one unnamed university in Czechia, told me, Vít, they don't even want to read the funny stuff, forget about some lists, of literature. And he was kind of bitterly complaining that the students don't really read. When we talk about ecological and environmental literature, I understand there's environmental anxiety and stuff like that. But without trying to generalize too much, do students read in general?
They do read. When they study at the English department, they have to read because they have to pass exams in British literature, American literature, and so on. But yeah, at a time of social media, longer texts become more and more difficult for them. That's true. So generally speaking, we could say that about this generation, but this does not necessarily has to apply to our students, because it's part of their job to deal with literary texts.
Just very briefly, I know AI is such a kind of prevailing subject these days that it's nearly a cliche to ask a question about that. But I have to ask you, are students trying to use ChatGPT when they are writing their essays and stuff like that? Can you recognize that? Because frankly, I've seen some articles in some of the Czech media where I see that, and I see that they definitely use ChatGPT.
Of course, it is. Like with the internet, we cannot and we don't want to ban the use of AI to any students. We are just trying to find new ways of, let's say, assigning written homework or essays, assignments that sometimes can make use of the products of AI, so they can generally approach what the AI generates. So a critical approach to AI is something that we are trying to cultivate, and we are trying to help the teachers, let's say, develop the tools and ways to integrate AI into teaching, because it will be here with us, and
whether we like it or not.
Whether we like it, exactly. So the first attempts in places like Italy and Australia, when at academia they discussed whether or not AI should be banned at universities. It's just impossible. You have to work with that. It's very challenging. That's a topic of lots of debates we have been having at this university, and I'm sure it's the same at other universities.
I think it was Seznam CZ out of the Czech media that actually came first with a kind of codex, the general rules, general guidelines of how to use it for journalists. Czech radio, now we have in the Czech radio quite clear rules. Have you got rules?
We have got rules that are rather general, because AI also develops and becomes more and more sophisticated. So we got rules that are at this point quite general, but we will be developing rules that apply especially to bachelor's and master's theses that will be much more specific. But still, they would have to be also adapted to different fields, because we are a comprehensive university with faculty of arts, faculty of music, and faculty of science, and faculty of medicine, and you cannot apply the same very specific concrete rules to the same subjects. But we are doing our best, and in the field of humanities that we were discussing earlier, AI should definitely help students structure their thought and so on and so forth, but they have to also apply their critical stance, as I said earlier, and they have to be able to formulate their arguments on their own.
Now, back to you again. You have served as Vice Dean, now as a Rector, since 2023. Recently, you became Vice Chair of the Czech Rectors Conference. Please let me know if I forgot to mention something. But my question basically is, how do you see the role of the leaders in academia in Czechia in 2025? What challenges do you see as important? What are the things that you discuss at the Rectors' Conference, for example?
Well, most often it's the budget. I'm afraid I have to start with money, because the resources are getting, generally speaking, smaller and smaller, and with what's on the table right now for the upcoming years, for Czech public universities, I should say, that's rather bad news. So of course we address that at the Czech Rectors' Conference. Obviously, the arguments that we use are comparisons that have to do with the money that goes into higher education in the countries of OECD. We also argue that the portion of GDP in the Czech Republic that goes into higher education is smaller than in most other countries. So that, I think, are objective comparisons that I think make our arguments quite relevant. So I'm afraid I have to start with money, even though I see other important issues, but those are interconnected. So let's talk about the other issues.
Before we get to that, I don't want to ask you political questions, but let me ask you just briefly this one, because you've been in this office since 2023. My son, for example, who just recently actually passed his master's exams at Charles University, political science, he's extremely disappointed by STAN, which is the Mayors and Independence Party, because they held the post of Minister of Education, and the present government, which is finishing quite soon, promised, that they would invest into education, and he says they didn't do that. Yeah, and I understand it's a political question, it's a sensitive question. Were your expectations fulfilled, at least, I don't know, to 50%, 60%?
That's hard to put it into numbers, but even though we understand that there are lots of pressures, we could be talking about the war in Ukraine, about COVID and the impact those had on the national budget. Obviously, that's problems that the current cabinet could not envisage 4 years ago. But still, most of us rectors are quite disappointed with the insufficient resources that are devoted to higher education.
So, to more kind of cheerful subjects. As I read from the materials that are available about you, you also study American cultural history, especially in California. Now, the answer may seem pretty obvious, but why California? Why not, I don't know, why not Texas, for example? There are more Czechs in Texas, I think.
That's a good question, because when people tell me that they either love America or hate America, I usually tell them there is no one America. Texas and California are the two big states. Represent two very different versions of America, actually two opposing and to a great extent contradictory versions of America. And the question is how things are going to unfold. So at this point, with President Trump in the White House, Texas is having the upper hand, which is obviously more conservative, more religious, applies more free trade policies and smaller state and smaller taxes and so on and so forth. I could go into depth here, but why California in my eyes? There have been tons of books written on this subject, but California is seen as a trendsetter, as a place that's basically cutting edge, which is at the forefront of development of different sciences, be it social sciences, but also natural sciences, IT technology. So most of the headquarters of the best known and biggest IT companies are in California. Silicon Valley is obviously associated with California. In my field, most of the, let's say, progressive trends in environmental thinking, but also environmental politics were formulated in California. And I could go on and I could list many other examples. And maybe I could conclude that lots of authors argue that whatever happens in California today is likely to affect the rest of America tomorrow and the rest of the Western world in a week. Yeah, metaphorically speaking, obviously.
Be it gay marriage, for example.
Of course,
and stuff like that. And speaking of California, I cannot not mention the name Steinbeck. Mm-hmm. And as I understand, I mean, you are very active in the Steinbeck, Steinbeck Society?
That's right, yeah, John Steinbeck Society.
John Steinbeck Society. Again, I cannot not mention, I had the privilege, I would say, to interview Thomas Steinbeck, the older son of John Steinbeck, back in 2011 in Santa Barbara. He was extremely nice. He talked about his father, but also about politics at that time. And it was very inspirational for me. But you are about John Steinbeck. What do you think remains relevant to readers today in 2025? It's, pretty soon it's going to be a century ago that he wrote his most famous pieces.
Right, I did meet Thomas Steinbeck too.
Where was that? No, I'm interested.
That was in San Jose, because I spent time on Fulbright. I was a Fulbright scholar in 2003 and 2004. So that means 22 years ago. I spent a year at San Jose State University, and one of the reasons was that they had the biggest archive of Steinbeck's work and memorabilia. There's a hard work to translate correspondence and so on. So I had access to lots of resources, but also to the leading Steinbeck experts. And of course, there were occasions on which I could meet John Steinbeck as well. I've written quite a lot on Steinbeck, but also was trying to unearth the layers or levels of his work that were not that much discussed, especially here in Czechoslovakia, because he was here interpreted as somebody who championed the working classes, but it's more complicated. He was interpreted as a pro-communist writer. He was not definitely a pro-communist writer. So in other words, he was misinterpreted. He was conveniently presented as somebody who was in line with the prevailing communist ideology in communist Czechoslovakia, and that was done through a very special genre in literature, which was called the afterword, that comes after the book, that was supposed to give the right and the only correct ideological interpretation of the work in question. But Steinbeck was much more complex. He definitely was a writer who sided with the poor and disadvantaged, which is something that appealed to lots of people in Czechoslovakia. There was also the reason why The Grapes of Wrath, his most important book, was published in Czechoslovakia in 1941 and was translated only in 70 days, including all the corrections, which is an incredible feat. And that was because it was in the air that American literature would be forbidden by Germans. We're talking about the year 1941, so in the middle of the Second World War. And the reason was, people wanted to hear that message, and it became the book of the year in Czechoslovakia in 1941. But sometimes later, a very well-known figure of the Czech underground or alternative culture, Magor, Martin Jirous, read all of Steinbeck, and at a time when he was imprisoned, he saw Steinbeck as a writer who spiritual elevated him and was helped him get through very, very difficult times. So in his writings, even Magor sees Steinbeck as an incredibly important writer. And you would not think that this classic would have so much appeal to this underground writer and poet.
Excuse me, just for the benefit of the listeners, Martin Jirous or Magor was really the kind of enfant terrible of the Czech descent, I would say, in the 1970s. And he was a poet, and he was someone that you would not kind of connect with Steinbeck. So that's why it is really interesting, isn't it?
That's right. So that's a very surprising connection between the two. What also appealed in Steinbeck to Czech writers, as Jan Zábran, another very famous thinker, says, is the desire of his figures, of his protagonists, desire for private property, the desire to do things your own way, even though in modest circumstances, which is a desire that's common to all probably poor people, and in that sense, even works like Of Mice and Men, which is another very well-known piece by John Steinbeck, can be interpreted as rather anti-communist in a way when you think about it, even though in the Czech Republic it was interpreted the other way around. Yeah,
it's very left-wing. Most of the news that we get from the United States is negative, and it is, what the present administration does. Have you, maybe we are just too shortly kind of into the second term of President Donald Trump, but we have had his first term. Do you think this affects how American culture and literature are kind of accepted, how they are perceived among the students in Czechia in general?
I don't think whether they make any link between works of literature that were written decades ago and the current presidential administration. I don't think so. It definitely can mean that America, especially in Europe, including the Czech Republic, can be perceived differently due to the current administration, perhaps more negatively, and there is research, there is evidence for the changing perception of the United States of America. But whether that has impact on the way we read and interpret American literature, I'm not sure.
You are rector of Ostrava University. How do you see the future of this institution in this part of Czechia? And now be a visionary.
Okay, that's not an easy one. The motto of our university is a university open to the world and working for the region, by which we want to say that we are an international university. So obviously we are competitive even on the international level when it comes to research and the outcomes of scientific projects. But at the same time, we want to apply the results of those findings on the issues that are prevalent in this region, in Moravia-Silesia, which may be called the third role of the universities, the first two being education, educating students, and the second one being research or science, if you wish, as we sometimes say. But we don't want to be the proverbial ivory tower that's isolated from the developments in the outside world. On the contrary, so one of my priorities when I was running for the office of the rector was to strengthen the third role, so that the society also can appreciate the role of universities, not only in the region but in the whole society in the Czech Republic. And I think we've been quite successful here because the cooperation between the university and the local as well as the regional authorities is very, very close. And I'm glad to say that the representatives of this region and city realize the importance of universities for the future of this region, not only because of brain drain, which is an actual problem that this region is having.
Perhaps one last question. I actually spent a year here in Ostrava in the early 1990s when a friend of mine and me started a language school, and we had high hopes for Ostrava, which to an extent did fulfill. And today I spent part of the day, walking around the beautiful city campus. But still, there is a brain drain from Ostrava. Young people are not coming. I mean, more often than not, they are leaving. And now I'm asking you as a rector of Ostrava University, but I'm asking about the whole city. How do you see the future? I mean, do you see that the potential can be fulfilled or is being fulfilled? What should be done?
But brain drain is a key to that, because we need to keep especially the educated people here. We know that lots of them are leaving for Prague, some of them are leaving for Brno. It also has to do with the opportunities that they have here. So we need to attract obviously more investments. We need to offer quality jobs in the fields in which we, for instance, here at this university, educate people. The good news is that, for instance, the biggest faculties of this university, Faculty of Education and Faculty of Medicine, produce people who tend to stay in this region. About 75% of them stay in this region. As for the Faculty of Medicine, over 80%, which is great. This is something that obviously regional politicians like to hear, because we are talking about the very basic services that you need to keep in your region for it to have some future, right? So that's a start, but then we need to make use of the synergies between the commercial sector, obviously the local and regional authorities and universities and schools. What also needs to change is the stereotypical image of Ostrava, the myth of Ostrava being really an ugly and a dirty and polluted city. I'm now exaggerating perhaps a little bit, but
well, not too much, quite frankly. A lot of people, who never came to Ostrava still think about it like Ostrava, what it looked like in the 1980s.
But when they come, they're surprised, and we just need to make the opportunities for the people to stay and even to attract people from the outside. Because given the demography, we know that in the future Ostrava could lose not only brains but lots of inhabitants. We are working really hard to reverse the trend.
Says the rector of Ostrava University, I have to say, if not the greenest, then one of the greenest cities in Czechia, the third largest city in Czechia. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
And I hope to hear from you sometime in the future again.
Yeah, thank you. It was a pleasure.
So that was Petr Kopecký, president of the University of Ostrava, a scholar, teacher and advocate for the role universities play in defending democratic values, inspiring students and shaping the future of their regions. Thank you for tuning in to Czechast. If you enjoyed this episode, please like or follow the podcast. It really helps us reach more listeners and bring you more stories like these. And don't forget to check out our sister podcast, Prague of the Beaten Track, where I explore the lesser-known corners of the Czech capital and the stories hidden there. If you have any suggestions or comments, I'd love to hear from you. Just write or leave a note wherever you listen. I'm Vít Pohanka, stay curious, stay safe, and I look forward to speaking to you again soon. Naslyšenou.
Czechast, a podcast in English about all things Czech. Whether you're an English-speaking expat living in Czechia and Slovakia, or a descendant of the Czechs, Moravians and Slovaks who left for a better life in America, Australia, Britain or Canada so long ago that you don't speak the language of the old country, this podcast in English is for you.